Maybe to kick us off today, Whitney, I'd love if you could start by sharing a little bit about your background. Sort of, you have a really interesting history, everything from being born abroad, growing up in the US, like you have a really interesting career background. I'd love if you could give us sort of the short version of your childhood and what brought you to this place today. Um, for those people who aren't very familiar with who you are and why we're talking.
Sure. I was actually, you had it exactly reversed. I was born in the U.S., but quickly moved overseas. My parents met and married in the Peace Corps, but were in the teachers in the Philippines and had moved back to the United States. Actually, my dad hadn't even finished college. That's how young they were. So they moved back to New Haven. My dad finished his senior year at Yale. They were both teachers in New Haven. When I was born in 1966, at age 2, we moved to Morogoro, Tanzania, was there for 3 years. My sister was born there. That was the first school I ever attended. And my parents, building on their experience in the Peace Corps, spent their lives in international development projects around the world. We lived 3 years in Nicaragua as well. So half my childhood was in Tanzania and Nicaragua. And then we sort of settled down in the U.S. for my sister and my teenage years in Western Massachusetts. I went off to Harvard. My sister went off to Stanford. My parents went off to Ethiopia 30 years ago, and they've now retired in Kenya. So they spent the last 30 years, 8 years in Ethiopia, 22 years now in Kenya. And actually, I'm very excited to see them. I haven't seen them in a number of months, but it is my youngest daughter's college graduation tomorrow. And so this is my first airplane flight, stepping foot outside of New York City in the almost 7 months since I joined the race. I'm out here in Northfield, Minnesota, the home of Carleton College, 45 minutes south of Minneapolis. And my parents just flew in from Kenya. And my sister, who I haven't seen in a number of months, flew in as well. And I'm about to see them after we finish this interview. So that's a little bit of my history and background. But after going to Harvard, was one of the founders of Teach for America and came and lived in New York 36 years ago, right after I graduated college. Went back to Boston for business school, a couple years of consulting, and then met and married a New Yorker. So I sort of joke that I wasn't lucky enough to be born a New Yorker, so I did the next best thing and married one. So I've been in New York now for 31 years. My wife and I have raised our 3 daughters here. Our youngest graduating college, our older 2 went away to college and are now back, so all in their 20s. And so I've had a very happy story here in New York. I've grown to love the city, and I'm fighting to, give every New Yorker the same great experience I've had in New York by fixing our schools, making housing affordable, making the city safe. And in particular, for my family, my wife is Jewish. And again, I joke that I wasn't lucky enough to be born into the tribe, so I married into it. And I told her on our first date we could raise our kids Jewish. I had enough Jewish friends to know that might be an issue, and I wasn't raised with any religion. So I've really embraced the Jewish community. Our whole family's been members of Central Synagogue for 25 years. And one of the big issues I'm running on is combating the alarming rise of anti-Semitism in the city. And as I'm sure we'll get to later, I think is being driven and instigated by Zoran Mamdani. And so I've been going pretty hard at him and his comrades at the Democratic Socialists of America, who I think are inciting a lot of these mobs that are making Jews feel unsafe in New York.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Oh my
Yes.
gosh, I have like 6 follow-up questions. I think, yeah, and I'm sorry I mixed up that you were age 2 in Tanzania. In my mind, for some reason, I thought you were born there. But one thing that kind of caught my attention about that is you clearly grew up in a family where your parents were very service-oriented, right? They were in the Peace Corps, they met there, they were teachers. Do you want to share a little bit about what kind of values you were raised with in your family? What was the ethos? Like, what did they impart upon you about service or contribution and helping others?
That was always something fundamental in our family. My parents, of course, led by example and the work that they've done. But I still remember my mom lecturing me, when I was a kid about, the speech went something along the lines of, "You are the luckiest young person ever to walk the face of the earth," in terms of, we weren't born into any particular wealth, but in terms of having wonderful parents who cared for me and sacrificed for me and my sister and made sure we got a good education and nurtured us, from the day I was conceived. And she always concluded the lecture by saying, if you take this good fortune and simply use it for self-enrichment, I will consider myself a failure as a mother, and you have an obligation to go out and use the gifts you've been given to try and help others and lift others up. So I've always remembered that speech, and it sounds sort of corny and cliche-ish, I suppose, but it's how I've chosen to live my life. So the three pillars of my life are my family, my work, and my philanthropy.
Yeah. Also, another thing from your early days that I wanted to dig into was being a part of founding TFA. So I was very lucky to have a roommate who was in Teach for America back when I first moved to New York. So I learned a lot about the program. She viewed Wendy Kopp as just an absolute incredible entrepreneur, or I guess social mission oriented entrepreneur. What role did you have in the early days of TFA? And is that sort of the first time that you really stepped into a service oriented work role?
Yes, certainly on a full-time basis. I mean, I'd done a bunch of little things in high school and college, raising a little bit of money. The very first thing I remember doing was back in high school, because my parents both worked at the boarding school I went to, Northfield Mount Hermon School, about 2 hours west of Boston. I did a used book drive where, all the students went home for the summer. And because I lived on campus, I was around. So I advertised it, put up posters all around the school, put boxes in every hallway of all the dormitories. It was the largest private boarding school in the country with 1,200 students. So, I collected thousands of books, and I took them to the bookstore, and you got 30 cents on the dollar. Something raised a couple $1,000s. And one of the teachers at the school had been in the Peace Corps down in the Dominican Republic. So I went down to the Dominican Republic and gave some money to a doctor and a couple scholarships, stuff like that. And it felt good. And that's something I was doing on a small scale. But coming out of college, it was my senior year of college. I was interested in business. I had job offers at Boston Consulting Group in the consulting world and First Boston, an investment bank, and was choosing between those two. And one of my friends, a guy named David Kopp, came up and said, "Hey, Whitney, what are you doing next year?" And I still remember this conversation well, because it was one of those defining moments of your life, that I'm sure everybody remembers. Well, in this case, I said, "Well, I'm not either First Boston or BCG, but what do you want me to do, David?" He said, "Well, my sister's got this idea to start this kind of Peace Corps kind of thing, but for teachers in high needs areas in the United States." And I sort of had in my mind, some, do-gooder, with interesting idea, but, could never pull it off. And I said, "Who's your sister?" And he said, "Wendy Kopp." And I slapped my forehead. I said, "Wendy Kopp? I know her." And I had met her at a conference of leading. It was, you had to be nominated by the dean at your college. And it was hundreds of students meeting with CEOs of major corporations. And it was run by a Princeton student organization called the Foundation for Student Communication. And the head of that student organization was none other than Wendy Kopp. And it was a conference that had been held a year earlier down at a hotel in D.C. And I remembered, the incredible students, student leaders from colleges around the country, but it also had CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And so I was incredibly impressed with the operation and with the woman running it. And I realized, okay, if you're going to pull off this big idea like Teach for America, somebody's going to have to fund it. And I could tell Wendy Kopp had a Rolodex of Fortune 500 CEOs she could probably raise money from. And I obviously knew she had the organizational ability and so forth. So all of a sudden, this idea that, when he first pitched it to me, sort of seemed like, loosey-goosey pie in the sky, could never make it happen. I realized if there was one graduating senior in the country who could pull this off, it was Wendy Kopp. So he gave me her phone number, called up, talked to her, and sort of on the spot, I said, "I'll come down to New York and help you start it." So came down, was employee number 2, I guess. There were 6 of us in donated office space that Morgan Stanley gave us. And I was there only for about 6 months and helped get Teach for America off the ground and helped recruit the first students. This was even before there were any core members in schools, but Wendy was committed to starting it big with 500 students in multiple cities all over the country. even though everybody told her, just start with a dozen students in New York or start small. She said, nope, we're going to go big from the get-go. And she was right. She's an incredible social entrepreneur. She and I are good friends to this day. She's married to the former CEO of Teach for America, in fact, Richard Barth, who's also a good friend. And that was really, even though I was only there for 6 months, it really opened my eyes to the inequalities in our educational system, the power of social entrepreneurship. And that really, really launched my life of philanthropy and founding multiple nonprofit organizations, being on the board of many of them over my life.
Mm-hmm. What a neat story. Small world. So what did you, okay, all right. So I want to make sure, I don't want to dig too deep into that period of time, but I know that you have a lot of other roles in your life related to education and giving back, right? You've been on board of KIPP charter schools for a long time, right?
Yeah, after I moved back to New York, Wendy Kopp, well, interestingly enough, I had at that point started the world's smallest hedge fund out of my bedroom, and had 2 little babies running around my apartment. This was back in 1999, and one of my friends from the hedge fund world read an article about Teach for America and called me up and said, "Hey, Whitney, I just read this article. Looks like a great organization. I'd like to donate to it. Do you know anyone there? Can you vouch for it?" And I laughed and said, "I was one of the founders 10 years ago." So I called up Wendy and I was like, "Wendy, I got a guy who's, rich guy who will donate some money. Can we meet?" And she said, "Yeah, why don't we go up and visit a couple schools?" So we went up to the South Bronx. It was Wendy and me and a dear friend to this day named Chris Stavru. And we walked into sort of a 1960s industrial style, really ugly school building in the poorest census tract in the United States. And we went up to the 3rd floor, and the elevators opened, and it was like a miracle. Again, one of those defining moments. I still remember meeting Dave Levin. There wasn't even, I don't even think there was a charter law at the time. So it was being run as this little independent school, as a skunk works by this Teach for America alumni named Dave Levin, who's still not officially running KIPP, but is chairman of it here in New York. And it was bright, and there were things on the wall about climbing the mountain to college and work hard, be nice. And the teachers were so engaged, and all the colleges that the kids were going to attend someday. And this was a middle school at the time. And again, it just opened my eyes to, wow, this was just something incredible. So I joined KIPP's board and have served on the board for more than 20 years until I resigned from all of my nonprofit boards 7 months ago when I decided to run for mayor. But if and when that finishes, assuming I do not win and become the next mayor, and then without a conflict of interest, I look forward to joining KIPP's board again. So that led me in so many directions. Was on the National Charter School Board, started something called Democrats for Education Reform with a couple of friends of mine also involved in the charter school movement and that was really where I got involved in politics for the first time about 20 years ago. It grew out of being on a charity board and then creating a political organization because, of course, charter schools, 97% of KIPP's funding is state and local funding. Charter schools are public schools. And so you've got to play the political game because, of course, the teacher unions are very threatened by non-union schools and try and kill us. And the more successful we are, the more they try to kill us. So we realized we'd better play the political game too, or they will succeed in killing us.
Let's dive into that. Let's talk about the political game. I think this came up in last night's debate, something about fighting battles back in the day with Bloomberg.
Yes.
And right. And
yes.
One
and
question.
I'm the only candidate in the Democratic primary who is willing to cross the teachers union. I'm a Democrat. I support strong unions, but but you've got to have a mayor and whoever's negotiating with them who is not beholden to them, who's fighting for what's best for kids. And in some cases, the union is fighting what's best for kids, but in some cases, like, for example, making it impossible to fire even the most incompetent teacher, that's where the interests of the union diverge from the interests of kids. And you better have a mayor who stands up for kids. And I'm the only person in the Democratic primary who's willing to do that.
You want to talk? Let's talk about education since we're already
Sure.
here. Um, you have a couple interesting and controversial views on education, if
Oh, yes.
I read this correctly. I think let's start with reading. So I've now heard you say in both debates something about fourth grade reading levels. And if you're not at a certain level by fourth grade, I believe the word you used is something like you're toast.
It's game over,
Oh,
is I
game
think
over.
the word I
Okay.
used. It was in the first debate, and it's come up in many mayoral forums. Unfortunately, I didn't. The topic of education didn't really come up in the second debate, so I wasn't able to really lean into this. The question, you may recall, was related to the class size mandate and how you would deal with it. And I said it's a terrible idea, and I will fight to roll back that legislation.
Yeah. So let's talk about the fourth grade reading levels and
Sure.
performance of New York City schools and what's going on with this whole language approach and what you
Yeah.
mean by game over.
Well, yes. So there are many, many ways to measure how students are doing and how schools are doing, right? If I were to tell you, I mean, you could measure high school graduation rates, you could measure, test scores or whatever. If I were to boil it down to a single most important metric, that if you could only give me one piece of data, what I would want to know is fourth grade reading. The reason is because the curriculum pivots from third grade, after third grade, to teaching kids to read, to reading to learn, learning to read, to reading to learn. And if statistics show that if a child cannot read at even a basic level going into fourth grade, then they can't, they're struggling in every class, not just reading. They can't read history and social studies and et cetera, et cetera. So if you, so if you want to know where your prison population comes from, where your welfare population comes from, the young people who do not escape the poverty that they were born into, who lead broken, ruined lives. Show me kids who can't read by fourth grade. And that is going to be wildly disproportionately people, because people who grow up to lead broken, ruined lives. And it's tragic. And it's an absolute disgraceful failure of any school that's had a kid for 5 years when you factor in pre-K, right? And a child can barely read 5 years later. And so this is why I'm the only person who has said one way to make sure you have no fourth graders who can't read is you end social promotion in third grade. The state of Mississippi has in fact done this. And that's one way to force the school system to educate kids, because it's real unpopular among kids and their parents to hold a kid back. But I think it's necessary to force the system to serve kids. So to give you an example of how bad this is, the gold standard NAEP test, National Educational Assessment, National Assessment of Educational Progress, that's given every couple years at the federal level, showed that 46% of New York City school children, third graders, or fourth graders, I guess, are testing below basic. There are 4 categories: below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. Now, ideally, you want kids proficient, right? If not advanced. But even basic, okay, they can at least get promoted to promoted. But below basic means a kid's years below grade level. There's a struggling reader. Those are the kids who are being failed worse, and it's nearly half the kids in New York City public schools. And it's not money. We're spending $40,000 a kid year after year, passing kids along. And worst of all, the school system is lying about it, because 90% of public school parents in New York City think their kid is reading at grade level. And the real answer is 45%. So, and this doesn't have to be this way. In Mississippi, which I just mentioned earlier, the poorest state in the country, they adopted a rigorous reading curriculum, extra tutors for students who need help, but very importantly, ended social promotion after third grade. And kids in Mississippi have now soared past those in New York. And guess what? They're only spending $12,000 a year. We're spending 40, they're spending 12, and their kids are outperforming ours. So you mentioned in your question the whole language and stuff. Part of the reason for the failure to teach kids to read is there was a horrible fad associated with this woman, Lucy Calkins, at Columbia School of Education that for decades infected our public schools, including New York City, called whole language. And basically it meant abandoning phonics, which is teaching kids to read by sounding out letters and words the way it's been taught for thousands of years, and instead saying, oh no, that's, I don't know, discriminatory toward poor kids or some such idiocy. And instead telling kids, oh, you can just figure out what the words say by the context or something like that. And this went on for years. Unfortunately, it's being uprooted in most places, including New York City. But sadly, there's lots of resistance from within teachers. You got to retrain teachers how to teach reading. And so this is part of the reason why we have so many struggling readers and why this would be the first thing I'd be focusing on.
Another thing that came up in the debate last night was about what department you think you could cut from. And you mentioned Department of Education, which
What seems surprising given I'm such a pro-education champion, right?
I think the way you framed it was there's a lot of like bureaucratic fat to trim. So I actually dug into the budget of the education department today and was actually really surprised to see that I believe only 1% of the budget goes to the central administrative offices. But I was really surprised to see that 9% goes to debt payments. And additionally, I can pull up this chart if you want, hang on, I'll share my screen here.
I'm not sure what you're looking at, but of the 100, but the number in terms of the overhead, I'm not sure how it's counted central office versus overhead in the schools. But I can tell you of the 306,000 employees of all of New York City, 150,000 are in the school system, and only 75,000 of them are teachers, which means half the employees, and therefore that's most of your costs, are not classroom teachers, and that's quite a bit higher than other peer districts. So there's enormous overhead and bloat in the system. So when I was asked, I wouldn't want to cut the overall DOE budget, but that is the first place I would look to find fat and savings that we can then reallocate into, for example, expanding 3K, which I strongly believe in, to all students. Right now, it's very limited. It's means tested. To hiring reading tutors, for example, for the young kids who are falling behind, who need extra help. So there are some. So I said on the debate stage, it sort of came out wrong because I guess the question was, what department would you cut? And I said, well, I would look for cuts in the Department of Education, but some areas to cut, but other areas I would spend more in, all within the DOE.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, it's sort of astounding. I mean, 1 million kids in the schools. We have 8 million?
Yeah, we're down to 938,000, I think. We were at 1.2 million 20 years ago. And even though the population of New York has been, depending on what time period you look at, but call it steady, a lot of families with children, especially, it's unaffordable in the city. They're not happy with the schools. And so we're still losing school kids, even as population remains stable.
That's actually a great segue into another topic I really wanted to discuss with you, which is people leaving New York City.
Yeah.
So, okay, this has been coming up over and over again. People keep talking about everyone's leaving because of affordability. But also people say things like, oh, wealthy people are leaving to go to, Florida to avoid taxes. And so one thing I was curious about is, like, a city can't just have everyone stay and have kids and all the kids afford to live here and new people move here for jobs. Like, some people have to leave, right? And if you don't want the housing costs to explode.
No.
Okay, let's dig into this.
I mean, look at cities. I mean, Nashville, Austin, cities that are run more efficiently, that haven't let the housing crisis. I mean, we can talk about how Austin addressed a housing crisis 3 years ago, and they've dropped rents by 20% in the last 3 years after they spiked by 25% in 2021. New York was growing and growing, and New York could easily have double its current population, I don't know, over the next 20 or 50 years or something. So this idea that New York, sort of has to stagnate, there's no more room, I don't buy at all. Here's an interesting factoid for you, by the way. The entire population of the world would fit into an area the size of Texas with the population density of Manhattan. So, Manhattan, by the way, Manhattan had a bigger population 100 years ago than it did today. Because people lived even without all the super high-rise buildings that we have
Still the
today, because
tenements,
people were in tenements and they were much more densely packed. So I'm not saying we should go back to that.
like six
Uh,
people in one room,
yeah,
I think,
exactly.
or more.
But no, going back to the 1960s, the city council basically outlawed the standard 6-story apartment building for working class people. And it's interesting, as I've traveled all around the city, I live in Manhattan. Most of New York City is actually sort of suburbia. It doesn't have high rises, not what people think of when they traditionally think of New York. And I think by changing the zoning codes, which fortunately is starting to happen because we've reached such a horrific affordability crisis, especially around housing, that why can't you make 2-story things 4 stories and 3-story things 6 stories? I'm not saying build skyscrapers in Staten Island, but there's so much room, these accessory dwelling units where, if you own a home out in Staten Island, you can build a little, almost like a bungalow in your backyard or something in your attic or your basement and rent it out to somebody who's younger and can't afford their own full apartment or whatever. These accessory dwelling units, this new City of Yes legislation has been a step in the right direction here, but there's a lot more we can do there.
Yeah, this is, oh my gosh, this feels like such the crux of so much of the debates that are happening around affordability. Like, I heard the term so many times last night and the last debate, and
Yeah,
it's very clear that the housing is the
you can
main
imagine
issue.
what it's like for me. For 7 months, I've been hearing nothing but.
Right. And like, there's only so much you can do about the price of groceries. Like, we're importing, although,
Yes.
certain people want to have city-run grocery stores, which is
No, only,
fascinating to
only
me.
one.
I have
Zoran
seen plenty.
Mamdani thinks it's a good idea for New
Yeah,
York
I like.
City to be operating 5 borough grocery stores, which is just the craziest thing I've ever heard of. My counter proposal I'm a big fan of Costco. If you want to save money, I actually went and priced a dozen eggs. The price of a dozen eggs at a C-Town, which is a local neighborhood supermarket in the South Bronx. And then I went over to Costco, and it was the exact same price, except at Costco you got 2 dozen eggs. It was half the price, right? So if you want to help groceries become more affordable for New Yorkers, I would, one, call up the CEO of Costco and be like, okay, what can we do to have you open? They're either 4 or 5 Costcos. I've lost track. I think they're 5 in New York City proper, and then there's one up in Yonkers. So I'd say, what can we do to roll out the red carpet to get you open up a bunch more Costco's in New York City? Because we're the richest city in the world. We have the highest population density. And I know you're doing big volumes because every time I go to Costco, I have to stand in a huge line no matter when I go, right? But the second thing I do is to shop at Costco, you have to be a member. So there's an upfront fee. And I would subsidize in the same way we subsidize fare cards for subways for low-income people and buses. I'd explore, at least I think it'd be pretty interesting to work with Costco and maybe offer a significant discount for people who qualify for fare cards, for example. They could come in and show a fare card, and Costco would let them sign up for $29 a year instead of $69 a year, or whatever the annual fee is, something like that. Now that's a smart way to deliver more affordable groceries to New Yorkers.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Can you imagine what a boondoggle city-run groceries? Because of course, under Mamdani, it'd all have to be prevailing wage. So, it'd be $50 an hour for, people who at any other supermarket are probably earning $20 an hour, right? Minimum wage in New York, $16.50. So the idea that the city government should be running supermarkets, and by the way, now you're competing against your own small businesses in a subsidized way. It's madness. It's not Exhibit A. It's probably Exhibit D or C or E or F, but of these radical socialist ideas that this 33-year-old DSA member is out there promoting. But it sounds sort of good. I'm going to help make New York affordable. I'm going to give you cheap groceries and city-run grocery stores, and people fall for this. He could win.
I know. I want to talk about that. I will say my 2 cents on the grocery store concept. So I'm a really big fan of food banks, and I would strongly support, there being more emphasis and investment in food banks for people who truly need it. The idea of city-run grocery stores to me is wild. I'm very curious if Zoran has ever visited Cuba. I have been inside of city-run grocery stores, and they had
I've been to Cuba
internal.
twice, and It's sobering. It's
Yeah,
sobering. I mean,
I would
obviously, I
agree.
don't think New York City is going to turn into Cuba under 4 or 8 years of Zoran and his comrades at the DSA, but that's sort of an extreme example. Cuba, I was just there a year ago, actually, and then I was there, I don't know, 10 years ago. I've been there twice. And even in the 10 years since I'd been there, it's a beautiful island, has fertile land, and should be an agricultural powerhouse. And people are hungry in Cuba. I drove 7 hours across Cuba, and all these fields had gone fallow. I didn't see any livestock, and it's this sort of hardcore socialism, and the government sets the price of things at artificially low levels, so farmers can't afford to farm. And so the country is going hungry in what should be an incredibly prosperous country, 50 miles from our shore.
Yeah, it was a very disturbing experience for me to be there. It was extremely eye-opening. But I
When
want
were
to
you there? How
rewind because I
long
do
ago?
want to talk about affordability, and I hear on the groceries, and the groceries are often what people talk about, and it is sort of like the daily thing we spend money on, where you like whip out your credit card and the numbers sort of jump out at you, and a lot of this, inflation has had a huge impact. But the biggest expense by far for New Yorkers is rent,
Yes.
and something like 70% of New Yorkers are renters, which I was actually surprised to learn. I thought that it would be more like 50%, but it's
Yeah. It's
70%.
the nationally of all Americans, 2/3 own, 1/3 rent. In New York, it's exactly the inverse, with the exception of Staten Island, which is the same as the national.
Right. And
Staten
it
Island's a
feels
little
that way in
slice of
Staten Island.
suburbia,
Yeah, Staten
tacked
Island
on
is
to
sort of
the
this
city.
odd borough.
Yes.
But let's talk about the rent. So,
Yeah.
okay, so some of the candidates are saying freeze the rent, which I think is a
Yes.
very catchy phrase.
Yes.
Now, what I loved your response last night was, I don't want to freeze the rent, I want to drop the rent. But your view is
Right.
to drop the rent by increasing supply, which of course
Correct.
like makes sense. But let's talk about, I mean, if this is so obvious, why isn't it happening now? And what would you do differently that would enable there to be more private sector development that could lead to these kinds of free market decreases in rent that you believe are possible?
Sure. Well, the freeze the rent is, of course, a slogan about half the rental stock. Half the people who rent in New York City are in rent stabilized apartments, and that the annual increases or not, flatlining, is set by the rent stabilization board, which the mayor appoints. So the mayor actually does have control over this. The problem is that if you freeze the rent and keep rents so far below market, most people think of, these buildings are owned by, massive developers or public companies and all. In fact, most of these buildings are often were bought 100 years ago, been passed down generation to generation. You are talking small landlords, and their labor costs are going up, their insurance, all their costs are going up. And if they have a rent stabilized building and they can't raise their rents, even though we're only talking 2 or 3% here is all that's on the table. If they can't raise their rents, they can't reinvest in the building. If an apartment becomes vacant by state law, if they invest $100,000 renovating the apartment so that they can rent it again to a new tenant. Let's say there's an old lady who's been in there for 30 years and is paying so far below market under a state law passed in 1999. They're not allowed to raise the rent at all to recoup $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 of investment in that one unit. So you have lots of units vacant. So I do not think it is a coincidence that the city with the most onerous rent regulations is the city with the worst housing crisis in the United States, right? So if you flatline the rent, you make it, you put even more financial pressure on the owners here, and our existing housing stock becomes more dilapidated, and some of it comes off the market. And then separately, what I'm talking about is if you want to reduce rent for the non-rent stabilized stuff, you just need to build a lot more housing. And so I would point to Austin, Texas, as a good example of what's possible. In just 4 years ago, in 2021, their rents went up by 25% because Austin was hot. It was, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of people wanted to move there. Supply didn't catch up, and rents jumped 25% in a year. But unlike New York, where, every community activist can hold things up for 10 years and the city government moves slow as molasses, et cetera. In Austin, they recognized a 25% spike in rents in 1 year. This jeopardizes our status as a growth city, as an affordable city. And so they leaped into action. They changed their zoning codes, sped up approval processes, et cetera. And within 2 years, they grew supply 15%. And there's now both a housing and an apartment glut in Austin, which is great for everybody. It's great for everybody but the owners, right? Rents and housing prices have both dropped more than 20%. And this all happened just in 3 years. So, why can't New York do this? New York could do this, but there's this unbelievably ossified bureaucratic process, the zoning regs that have built up over time. Sometimes an environmental review can stall something for 2 years. Dealing with the city bureaucracies, so many businesses, including real estate developers, have to hire expediters to navigate the unbelievable bureaucracy. The whole ULURP process, the land use process, has 6 different bodies or entities. Any city council person can just, at a whim, they have like a pocket veto for any development in their city council district. All of this is good ideas taken to extremes. In most cases, reasonable ideas that you want to have some zoning. Of course, you want to have some environmental review. You want to have some local input, but it gets taken to extremes. And as a result, every real estate developer I talk to tells me, 1, they treat us like the enemy, and 2, I'm done with New York. And go look at Hoboken, Jersey City, Newark. All the New York developers are building like crazy over there. And when we're losing to those cities, we've really screwed up. And so, it used to take 2 years start to finish on a project under Bloomberg. It's now elongated to 4 years. And with the high cost of financing these days, the difference between 2 years and 4 years from start to finish on a project is the difference between a viable project and a non-viable project. So there's no reason we can't get back to the average project taking 2 years.
Right. Oh man, I have so many thoughts on this. I'm trying to think about, what do I really want to say here? The thing that is the most concerning to me about the rent stabilization situation is these units being taken offline.
Yes.
I dug into this a couple months ago because someone who is a landlord in New York told me about the problem and basically said, we have this situation. We have a bunch of old buildings that are dilapidated. We have people exiting, leaving these units, and the units are trashed, 40 years, haven't been renovated at all. We have all these new codes we have to bring the unit up to. We have to move the toilet 3 inches over so it's further from the wall. And we have to get rid of asbestos and the, lead paint. And we might have to do $100,000 worth of repairs. But then when the rent is going to be stuck at, $500 a month for a place that on the free market would be $2,000 a month, and we can't even raise it 2%. We just turn the unit into a storage unit essentially and just take it off the market. And this person told me there's something like 100,000 units now in New York offline, just not on the market because of this. So my concern with this freeze the rent ideology is as attractive as that may sound for right now, what happens 5 years from now when you have 200,000 units off the market or more?
Right.
And when, people just don't want to go into the landlord business. I mean, there's tens of thousands of landlords in New York City.
Yes.
And it's a tough place to be a landlord. It's not free to run a building. You have to, pay for trash, electricity, and repairs, and roofing, and plumbing. And,
Absolutely.
So I'm very concerned about this slogan.
Yes. I've heard similar stories, and nobody knows the number because it's not a number that's tracked. Yeah, it might be 20,000 units. I've heard up to 100,000. I'd be surprised if it's that high. But there's the freeze the rent, which means with your existing tenants, are you allowed to raise the rent at all, just across your entire building? Then there's the what happens when an apartment becomes vacant. So, imagine a little old lady who's been in an apartment for 30 years, and on average, her rent's only been going up 2% a year for 30 years, but the market has been going up 4% a year. So like you said, maybe she's paying $700 out in LaFrac City in an apartment that markets $2,500. Well, separate from the rent stabilization board and being able to increase the rent 2% a year, let's say, even below inflation, but at least you get something. There's what happens if the little old lady dies or moves away after 30 years. The landlord then, as you point out, needs to invest a large amount of money in there. Now, this is not controlled by the Rent Stabilization Board. There was a law passed called Rent Stabilization Housing Affordability Act, is I think the name of it, back in 2019, that was meant to protect rent stabilization, all rent stabilized apartments from, there were some unscrupulous landlords who, if an apartment became vacant, or even if someone were still living there, they would go in and put in a new dishwasher, make some minor upgrade, $1,000. And then they would say, oh, we've made a capital improvement, we're going to double your rent. Okay. And that little old lady paying $700, all of a sudden the landlord tries to jack it to $2,100 because he put in a new dishwasher. So that would be obviously an abusive landlord taking advantage of a loophole in the law or whatever. But of course, up in Albany, any good idea always gets taken way too far. And now they basically made it impossible for the landlord, if the little old lady moves out and the apartment needs to be renovated, to, obviously, if you think citywide, you want the people who own buildings to invest in them, to maintain them, and to upgrade them, to expand them, et cetera, right? This law basically precluded anyone from owning a rent-stabilized apartment from raising the rent, even if you put $100,000 in or $200,000, and even if the apartment's been vacated, right? So went way too far, and hence landlords, if they can't get a return on their capital, they're just going to leave that apartment vacant, and so they padlock it. So how many of those are out there? Who knows? But the landlords are sort of waiting, hoping that not being willing to put up 100 or 200 or 300 grand and getting no return on it, but two, hoping that the legislature might come to its senses and change the law. And then they're happy. They would be delighted to invest. I mean, we're the richest city in the world, highest population density, with a 1.4% vacancy rate, the lowest in 60 years. Trust me, the private investors want to invest in this city, but all of these factors, from building new construction to renovating existing places, et cetera, we've gone way too far and made it almost impossible. Now, by the way, another piece of this is trying to evict somebody that stops paying you takes on average 12 months in New York. And again, there should be protections for tenants, right? They shouldn't be on a whim be thrown out on the street if they miss a payment or encounter hardship. But if you can never evict someone who just stops paying you, and there are people who just take advantage of the laws here, who's going to rent their apartment?
Right. It's I think housing is a fascinating topic, and we could probably talk a whole hour on it, but I also want to be mindful of time and make sure that we cover another major issue that you have been focused on, and that is crime. So if it's okay, can we shift over to that topic since we have about 10 minutes? Okay. So one thing that I have been frustrated by in listening to the debates is everyone throwing around these numbers on if crime is up or down, but they are not being clear about what time period they're discussing.
Yes.
So if you talk about, oh, it's up now, is it up over last year? Is it up compared to 2020? Is it up compared to the 90s?
Sure.
There's a lot of ways you can cut the numbers, and I did dig into the numbers. I have a bunch of charts in front of me. It's not such a clear picture. Like, some crime is up from 5 years ago, some is down. There's, the subway has gotten worse, but it's unclear compared to what time. I mean, you lived here in the 90s. I've seen charts showing what was happening here in the 90s. I'm like astounded by what it looked like, murder rates in the 90s.
Right. Or go watch the documentary Drop Dead City about the debt crisis in New York in 1975. And it's just a fascinating historical look at, the Bronx was burning.
Right. I've seen footage
so
of what that looked like.
We've come so far from those days.
I've read Bill Bratton's book. He was the head of NYPD under Giuliani. He wrote this incredible book called The Turnaround and talked about actually the most interesting part of he talked about his whole approach, but a lot of it had to do with sitting by the turnstiles and catching people and then like lining them up and handcuffing them all to each other and then taking them out and processing and all.
Theory of policing, where he implemented broken windows theory of policing and enforcing jumping turnstiles and all, because it turned out a lot of people jumping turnstiles were carrying weapons or who had other charges against them. And so that was really a critical element of reducing crime in New York dramatically.
So maybe, yeah, on this topic, I'd love to know your perspective. I mean, on some level, it's kind of like, does it even matter if it's up or down, 2%, 5%, this or that over last year? Like taking a step back from the direction that things are going in, which can have so many different factors. How safe do you feel New York City is today? And when you talk about people saying they want to leave because they're concerned about safety, like, do you think that those fears are grounded in reality or, inflamed by the media? Like, and what are the changes you would like to make? Like, what do you like? How bad is the problem, and what would you like to do?
I too have studied this and pulled decades of data and parsed it by 7 major felonies, the next 7 felonies, then 23 misdemeanors, and what are the long-term trends over time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would just say big picture, from the peak of the New York City murder rate in 1991 at roughly 2,250 murders, we had almost a 90% decline in the murder rate, and it bottomed around 2017, 18, 19, and then started to tick up even before the pandemic. The pandemic really accelerated. The 7 major felonies rose about 50%, and some of them have come down, particularly the murder rate over the past couple years. So I would say, and then just this year, murders are down 28% year over year. Shootings are down 21%. The other major felonies are down sort of single digits. Felony assaults are almost at a 25-year high. So it really depends on which statistic you're looking at, as you said, over which time period. But I would say it is not New Yorkers' imagination that the city has become more disorderly, less safe since the multi-decade lows of safety that we reached just before the pandemic. So a lot of people are saying, oh, I was here back when, the murder rate was still 10 times what it is today. Great, but it's still up. It's not as safe on almost any metric as it was 5 years ago. And that's what people remember, right? And that's what people want. And that's what we should have. So how do you fix this and address this? You need, there are a lot of different things and long-term causes of crime and fixing our schools. And making kids who get a great education, go off to college, who are prepared for the working world, generally don't turn to lives of crime, right? But in the near term, it comes down to policing. Police have become really demoralized over the last 5 years as crime has increased, and they increasingly have had their hands tied with, again, legislation that went too far, well-intentioned legislation that went too far in the areas of bail reform, discovery reform. And, the state legislature has tried over the past few yearly sessions has tweaked some of this to try and fix it. I'm glad we got some discovery reform as part of the latest budget negotiations. A lot of this that affects the city, you got to fix it up in Albany. But the mayor does control the police department, appoints the police commissioner. And I'm happy to say we've got a great police commissioner right now, Jessica Tisch, who's cleaning out the rot and cronyism under Mayor Adams, some of his cronies at the top of the NYPD that was also contributing to demoralizing the rank and file. We're at a 34-year low today in the number of police officers. We've got to rebuild that by slowing down, improving morale and slowing down the number of people retiring, but also recruiting. The number of people applying to become officers has declined from 18,000 to 8,000 over the last 5 years. So obviously you have to reverse that trend. So there are a lot of things we have to do, but we also have to, I sort of have a slogan out there on the campaign trail. We need to make crime illegal again. We basically decriminalized all but the most serious crimes. And so there was a huge surge in, just people walking in. Talk to any restaurateur or any retailer in the city, and they'll tell you the brazenness of people just coming in and sweeping the shelves. That's why, all the shampoo and everything on the drugstores is behind plexiglass, because it was so brazen. So I think under Jessica Tisch, she's got a great quality and life initiative underway. They've started ticketing these e-bikes, blowing through red lights and up on the sidewalks and making people feel unsafe in that way. She's got a precision policing approach, so it's not going back to the old days of stop and frisk, but focusing in the highest crime areas. She calls it flood the zone, more cops in the highest crime areas. and quality of life initiative. All of these initiatives are combining, I think, that I finally feel some optimism that we're headed in the right direction.
I'm also a big fan of hers.
Yeah. By the way, I only have 3 or 4 minutes left, and one element that I did want to touch on before we get off is, as I mentioned at the beginning, my wife and children are Jewish. We've been members of Central Synagogue for 25 years, and I can tell you, New York City's Jewish community, over 1 million Jews live in New York City, more than 12% of the population. The largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the entire world is here in New York. And particularly since October 7th, there's just been a surge of anti-Semitism and manifests in so many different ways. But we've seen, the encampments and very loud, disorderly protests on college campuses, but also into our streets. There have been some violent attacks. And I respect the right to protest, but in many cases it has gone too far. It's turned into violence. It has made the New York Jewish community feel unsafe. And Zoran Mamdani has been one of the leaders of the Democratic Socialists of America. And, core, he has said, going back to his teenage years, his core focus in life has been the Palestinian cause. And I sympathize with the Palestinians and their plight, but he has refused to visit Israel, denied Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, has whipped up these mobs with incendiary language around genocide, apartheid, leading the BDS movement. He said he would arrest Netanyahu if he came to the United States. And so on the debate stage, and in my messaging and in some of my paid media and all, I've been warning New York City's Jewish community about a guy who I think is fundamentally hostile, I know, to Israel. And he says, oh, it's nothing against Jews. And I was like, your lifelong obsession is hostility toward Israel, but, oh, you love Jews. Come on, give me a break. I can read your tweets. And so that has been, combating anti-Semitism is something that I made a major platform. And one of the reasons why I said on the debate stage last night that after ranking me 1, you should rank Andrew Cuomo number 2, because if you believe the polls, which I think are likely, it is going to come down in ranked choice to a runoff via ranked choice between Andrew Cuomo and Zoran Mamdani. And I think electing a 33-year-old inexperienced radical socialist who's, in general, who's part of a movement that seeks to abolish capitalism, who wants to disarm, defund, and dismantle the police. These are direct quotes from his tweets from the DSA website. But in particular, if you're Jewish, and care about Israel and safety for Jews, a guy who's been inciting these mobs against Israel and making Jews feel unsafe. Make sure you vote Cuomo number 2 after me, and don't rank Mamdani, because a Mayor Mamdani in City Hall with his DSA comrades around him, I think would be ruinous to this city.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. All right, so last question.
Yes, I have 1 minute left, and then I got to get on another call.
Okay. The one I want to ask is, why run? Why did you run? Like, what called you to do this? It's really
keep
hard.
in mind, at the time I decided to run back in November, it was a very open field. It wasn't at all clear Cuomo was going to run, and or that Mamdani would take off. It was a bunch of career politicians, very lefty. I'm a centrist Democrat, a business-oriented Democrat, and I saw a lane, particularly after 47-year-old political neophyte named Daniel Lurie got elected mayor of San Francisco, which faced many of the issues here that we face here in New York. So I saw a lane, but I figured I'm either going to win, which would be great, but if I don't win, I can qualify for city matching money and amplify issues I care about, like education reform and crime and law and order and anti-Semitism. But also might be able to use my money and being on the debate stage to affect who does win. And so I'm very clearly trying to stop Mamdani as well in these last days.
Okay, great.
So it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Whitney.
All right,
Really nice
take care.
you.
All right, bye-bye.